Thank you everyone for coming and joining us on your lunch, or if you're in the UK around the end of the day. It's great to have everyone. I'm Sam Naylor, along with David Asher here. We're the co-chairs of the BSA Housing Committee. This is our first fall event, talking about London and Boston and housing regulations. We plan to have a couple more events this fall. Dates TBD, one on perhaps the new recent built outcomes of MBTA zoning around towns in Massachusetts, one on procurement and design competitions as they relate to public land dispersals and the pipeline for architects. And we're also hoping to have just a kind of networking, unprogrammed housing nerd fun session at some point in the fall where we can just get together in person. And some of those events might be in person, hybrid, or virtual. This one, for reasons of geography, made sense to make a nice lunchtime virtual event. And I would just say this came about because Kate and I work together at UTL and both have experience in the UK and the US. I mean, Kate comes from Ireland and has worked in London and other places. I think she'll talk more about that, her experience. But we been comparing for probably a year the differences between Boston and UK housing, and are really keen on how to understand how regulations influence design, because I think there's a lot of aspects of built housing that come from regulation, less so than they come from market conditions or building codes requirements. And if you know me, I care a lot about the building code too, and the zoning code. So we have this event. Kay and I will talk briefly, and then we'll hear from Alex, and we'll hear from Karl, and we'll have tons of time for discussion and follow-up as well. And this is being recorded. It'll be posted later. Now the BSA has these events on a YouTube channel, and you can find David and I's email on the BSA website as well if you have any questions about housing events or want to get involved. We're really excited to, jumpstart this fall with more programming and talk a lot about housing. Okay, so I will just get into it. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Sam. In addition to me at the BSA, I'm an architect and associate at UTL, work on mostly multifamily housing in our practice, both market rate and affordable. And I also do a lot of design research on housing through various universities. I also want to introduce Karl, who will speak later. Karl's an architect with the City of Boston, Mayor's Office of Housing. His work is focused on design review and development of affordable housing opportunities within Boston. Prior to working at the city, he was a project architect at Haller and Yoon, and also taught studios at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. With a wide range of experiences and interests, he enjoys both the possibilities and necessities of an architect as a generalist who provides their own expertise while also facilitating large teams of collaborators to pursue exceptional work.
Thanks, Sam. My name is Kate Rush. I will be co-hosting with Sam. I'm an associate architect at UTL. I work a lot in multifamily housing in Boston. But prior to Boston, I spent much of my time working in London in multifamily housing, which is why I'm very excited to introduce Alex Ely. I first encountered Alex's work through the London Housing Design Guide as a young architect, a very stressed young architect. And it was something I think many of us in practice referred to daily. It really shaped my understanding of how to design housing in the city. And I think what struck me then and what kind of still resonates today is how it was able to distill very complex regulations into very kind of practical design principles, which is no easy feat. Alex founded May in 2001, and since then he has developed it into a Sterling Prize winning architecture practice renowned for sustainable and socially responsive design. He is a key figure shaping UK housing policy, and he has authored many influential documentation, which includes the London Housing Design Guide, among other kind of numerous best practice publications. His expertise is in urban strategy and urban design. He has redefined kind of national standards, advancing architectural approaches to creating more inclusive, sustainable communities. And he bridges kind of practice and public service. He's the chair of the Museum of Home and a member of the RIBA Housing and Planning Expert Advisory Group. He was formerly a Mayor's Design Advocate and Design Council CABE expert. And he is a regular voice on international platforms championing architecture's role in tackling today's urban challenges. So welcome both speakers. Thank you for joining us today. I think Sam's going to kick us off with the slides.
Yeah, we're going to talk for just a few minutes on the differences between London and Boston, and also like aspirations we have for architecture as we're jealous of the other context. I think two of the biggest differences between the two communities is the way we build structurally, and out of, majority of housing, if I'm not wrong, is cast in place concrete. There's a culture of it. There's dimensions and typical formwork sizes that are known by structural engineers and architects. So it's just it's actually modular, even though it's, liquid that turns to rock. And it allows a lot of different kinds of possibilities. Whereas in the US and especially in Boston, the majority of mid-rise multifamily is built out of sticks, built out of lightwood framing, sometimes on a podium, sometimes not. 2-by construction with trusses or joists and sheathing on top. I think what these two differences, aside from zoning and regulation and code differences, mean is that those, structural DNA gets telegraphed and expressed into the facade. So I think there's an opportunity at the same, value proposition to have more depth, more insets and balconies, more shadow lines in the facade with cast in place concrete framing, as you see in some of the more London examples. We're also going to talk about, balconies as they relate to regulation. Whereas in Boston, the assemblies are a lot thinner, and it's very expensive to make ins and outs and to, jog the water and thermal line. And so there's, unless they're very significant moments or integral to the project, there's less opportunity for those things. So, both contexts use residential proportioned windows and apertures and dividing lines, but through different materials to achieve kind of similar effects.
We just wanted to briefly kind of give some perspective on how the documents Alex and Karl will be speaking about fit into the larger framework of policy documents in both contexts. So on the London side, you can see here kind of highlighted in yellow that London Housing Design Guide. There has been subsequent documents to that, but it kind of supports the London plan. So it's really about implementing the London plan and explaining how policies work in practice. And then at kind of the local level, again, there are borough specific kind of policies, but everything is kind of sitting within that national policy framework. So the London Plan is sitting within that, but these documents are really about kind of helping you understand how to implement these policies. The London Housing Design Guide is non-statutory. The London Plan is statutory, and that kind of means that statutory is a legally binding document. Non-statutory is just kind of an advisory, influential document. So that's just giving context on the guidance in London.
And in Boston, the US, I mean, we have the additional level of state regulation, but I think one key difference that was interesting for us to talk about is we have some housing design standards at the state level through the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. There's design standards, and then for Boston, there's the MOH Design Guide, which Karl's going to talk about, both of which only touch affordable housing, actually. So there's no standard yet for both kinds of housing, all housing. But from what we understand, the city is working on revising the kind of zoning code and these neighborhood zoning design guidelines and standards, which are embedded in each neighborhood. to be citywide and to be about all kinds of housing. So that might be a layer that begins to achieve the same kind of scope that the London Guide is after. And
I'm on
you
mute,
know,
sorry.
we want to talk about floor plans. I'll let you go, Kate.
Yeah, sorry. We just wanted to kind of flip through some typical, units to just to give a good context between both conditions. So this is an example of kind of a best practice one bed, two-person unit in London, which is part of the housing design guidance, the LPG document. I think the biggest difference that people may spot here is the private balcony, which is a requirement in London. Every home with 1 to 2 bed spaces has to have private outdoor space. So, for example, in a one bed, you must have 5 square meters, so roughly 55 square feet of outdoor space accessible from the unit. And that incrementally gets bigger as the unit gets bigger. The other kind of best practice element to note here is dual aspect. So this unit is actually a deck access, so it is access from an external corridor, which means that the unit has light ventilation coming in from both sides. The other kind of maybe interesting best practice element here as well is that it kind of has an internal kind of lobby or foyer where all the other rooms are accessed. So you have that kind of additional layer of circulation and privacy. Pass over to Sam.
And I mean, remarkably, the Boston one bed is similar, and I think same general layout. There's also a similar focus on accessibility, on livable furniture layouts, and minimum space standards. There's perhaps a lack of a foyer, not the same requirement for a balcony. You can see the wall, thickness, the poche reflects the different construction technology. And there's also a greater requirement for built-in storage than there is for the London one. And just to say, we have real market rate example here. The next slide is going to be an affordable example. And I think the London one, again, this is a built example where it's maybe a very typical market rate condition of a single aspect unit with a balcony. And, maybe it doesn't have a foyer, it doesn't have those same aspirations. And the Boston version having also a similar layout than the guide with thinner walls and perhaps a bigger closet is another notable difference aside from the balcony.
And this is just showing an affordable type. So again, in the London version, you have a deck access, so dual aspect. In affordable conditions, there's kind of more preference to have the kitchen as a sort of separate space. And I think, yeah, it's very similar to kind of the first one we showed again. There is private amenity space for all of these units.
And the big difference in the affordable one bed in Boston, I would say, is the kitchen gets larger because there's greater requirements for what's included or linear counter space, accessibility. And so it's less about division, but more emphasizing that it's, very usable because this is probably somewhere where people are going to live for a longer amount of time.
And then what's interesting about the affordable 3 bed in London is the kind of preference to have 2 separate rooms for kitchen and living, both with operable windows. The other interesting thing is as a type, this kind of 3 bed 5-person is also quite desirable because it reduces the size of a 3 bed. So one of the bedrooms is a single room, not a double. So it does kind of really reduce the size of 3 beds, probably makes them more cost efficient compared to the Boston type, which I think some all require to be double rooms.
Yeah, or a minimum 10 by 10 size.
10 by 10, yeah.
So you don't get that optionality. And I think the other notable difference is because most buildings are double loaded corridors with a kind of fixed bar depth. 3 beds are a lot of times on the corner, but their inherent DNA, the width, maintains that depth. And so, I mean, this one has 200 square feet more than this example over here, but a lot of that space is in closets or bathrooms or in the kind of deeper, less naturally lit area of the plan. And there's a little bit less spatial division between the main living spaces as well.
Okay, so just and we can flick through these really quickly. These are just kind of some really interesting snapshots I think we found in the London guidance. You know, number of homes accessed from a core should not exceed 8. That's kind of the best practice if that is the case. The corridor needs to get a bit wider, or it needs to kind of break up into subclusters, which is very different to Boston.
Yeah, I think without that requirement for large sites where there's multiple buildings, there's the same level of emphasis on really great programmable, usable open space, but it's usually bounded by the least number of buildings possible for, cost reasons, and those are just become extended alphabet-shaped double-loaded bars to kind of shape and surround the open space.
Internal corridors, if they are kind of double banked, they should be receive kind of daylight, be short as possible, kind of get some light from the core, which is, quite difficult to do, but in a lot of London housing kind of successfully achieves this, which is quite different to the Boston condition, where, the corridor does become very long and generally does not have access to daylight. Um,
And so there's a lot more emphasis on making the corridor, have moments for personalization at the door entry or designed in such a way that there's a little bit more articulation and color and lighting because it doesn't have that short length or access to daylight.
Another really big component of kind of London housing is the desire for many of them to be dual aspect. If they cannot be dual aspect, it's kind of restricted to, one beds or studios. And I think a really important part here to note is that none of these units should be north facing single aspect. So that's a very kind of different condition to what's allowable in the Boston context, where that is allowable in some developments.
Yeah, and we don't really have laws on aspect, and so it depends on the site and orientation, but often the layout will be with the majority of the units facing only a single aspect, and if it happens that half are facing north or northeast or northwest, that's kind of how it is.
And then I know we mentioned this already, but the provision to have a minimum of 5 square meters of private outdoor space, this incrementally gets bigger as the unit gets bigger. So for every person within the unit, 1 square meter is added to that. And I think what's really kind of important about this is it really kind of shapes how housing is viewed in the city. It really makes buildings look like housing buildings, and it really kind of helps the internal arrangement of units. It helps with passive shading, ventilation, daylight. And there's so many, positive outcomes to having this as part of every single home in the city.
And I think in Boston, there's some balconies on market rate buildings, depending on location or orientation or optimal views, maybe facing the ocean, kind of depending on the client and the desire. They're expensive, and so they're very carefully selected. What's on almost all market rate projects is a collective deck or courtyard, common open space for everyone to gather. But that same, you know, client desire or code desire doesn't exist for affordable, where the emphasis and really is on getting the most units you can for the site, because that's what the funding sources demand, and it's kind of what's needed, especially also for the market. And so you end up with buildings that are really focused on the units and building as many units on the site rather than having an open space as well. Okay, that was our quick back and forth, and
Wasn't that
we're gonna,
quick?
yeah. No, it wasn't that quick. We should have gone
Sorry.
quicker.
So yeah,
Okay.
we're going to pass over to Alex.
Great, thank you very much. So let me share my screen. Really interesting to hear the comparison there, and it's a great scene setter. You drew attention to a couple of things that are sort of massively quickly changing scene in London. The BSA shares an acronym with our Building Safety Act, which has just been introduced. And that has caused a huge rupture in how we design and added requirements now that challenge some of the London Housing Design Guide that I'll talk you through, particularly around the sort of requirement for a second stair above 18 meters. And what that is leading to is actually sort of plans more like the ones you've been showing in Boston, the sort of double-loaded corridor arrangement. And unfortunately, a sort of move towards more single aspect rather than away from it. But let me go through the London Housing Design Guide, and we can perhaps come back to that in the Q&A and what the sort of current influences and pressures are on this. So hopefully I can get a thumbs up. You can see my slides okay.
Yeah, all good. Thanks, Alex.
So you've already set the scene in terms of where the London Housing Design Guide sits within our legislature. As Kate mentioned, it's it's at a regional level, part of the London plan. So the standards are set within the London plan. So it's a negotiating tool for the planning authority to demand better quality, but often it's one that the developers kind of push back on because they argue through planning that there are challenges in terms of viability. And that's just how our democratic system works. Whereas further down on this pyramid, you see that building regulations right at the bottom are the very technical standards that we have to comply with. So that's the engineering standards in terms of foundations or ventilation or daylight and so on. So there is a degree of negotiation on the London Housing Design Guide, and I'll sort of explain further how that happens. So first off, why was it introduced? We were commissioned in 2007 to write this on the back of a lot of evidence that London's housing standards were falling, that we had some of the smallest space standards across Europe. If you compare to the generosity of certainly Scandinavian housing, German housing, we were seen to be delivering some of the smallest homes. And we were having chronic problems, especially in our affordable and social housing with overcrowding, which has huge knock-on effects with our health, both physical and mental health, family tensions, poor performance in schools. A lot of that can be attributed to poor quality of housing. And so there was a desire on the part of the mayor to do something about that. And so our commission was really to look at all the standards and different requirements that were being used in different contexts. So we had situations where those providing money, i.e. in the form of government, to registered providers had their particular standards. We had the government land agency having its own standards. And so part of this commission was, as it says here, a recalibration of all the standards and trying to bring together. It was a sort of synthetic exercise of bringing together the existing standards and consolidate them, simplify them, and set out in one document an overarching set of requirements relevant to London. But also building up a new evidence base specifically for these space standards. So just these won't necessarily mean much to many of you, but just to give a context to the sort of standards we were bringing together. We had Building for Life, which was more about placemaking, and that was advocated by a government agency called the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment and our Home Builders Federation. We had the design quality standards, which is what the housing funders and housing corporation housing quality indicators used. We had Lifetime Homes, which was promoted by a particular housing association and became widely adopted about improved accessibility in the home. And then we have things like Secure by Design, which are promoted by the police force about safer environments. So London Housing Design Guide sought to bring together these different technical requirements. But it also had to bear in mind other supplementary guidance that existed in planning. We have requirements around provision of children and young people's play space because the standards, the guidance is much more than just the home layout itself. It also stretches into the public realm and around the home. It picked up other guidance around wheelchair homes and also environmental standards, the Code of Sustainable Homes. So all these, it was a lot of exercise, sort of 400 odd standards to try and consolidate into a much simpler document. The headline policy that demands better quality is sitting in this document, the Housing Supplementary Planning Guidance, which has since been updated, but at the time it was this document. And specifically, the policy that officers review and any legal challenge for a scheme would be assessed against is this one, 3.5, which states that housing development should be of the highest quality internally, externally, and in relation to their context and to the wider environment. So it's kind of at the scale of a city right through to the room. Now, obviously, if a designer or developer challenges refusal of planning on the grounds of that this policy hasn't been met, then clearly it's a could be quite seen as quite an objective policy and quite challengeable. So the Housing Design Guide is essentially giving the backbone to this policy and setting out what we mean by high quality internally and externally. So how was it structured? First off, it promoted requirements around shaping good places, and I'll illustrate a few of those. It was sort of recognizing that successful housing is part of a city, that it has to also have good relationship to its neighbours, to the street, to the public spaces around it, that it has to promote diversity so that we're not creating ghettos of mono-tenure housing, whether that's economic ghettos of social tenants versus private, or whether it's about ensuring that there's greater diversity in terms of the mix. It looked at requirements that address the relationship of the home to the street. So we know a lot of post-war housing failed in this regard. It didn't have very good urban aspect onto the street, so that we know kind of better relationship between kind of regular active front doors, for example, improves passive surveillance, sense of security, and mitigates some of the problems of poor urban design. And then being the focus of Sam's introduction, the sort of dwelling space standards, which I'll illustrate. And importantly, recognizing that homes are a place of retreat and privacy, and balancing the needs of the community with the needs of the household. So, and then the sixth chapter is about climate change mitigation and adaptation. And since writing this, our regulations have moved quite rapidly in this regard. So it's actually become much more standard that our building performance has improved. Arguably, our carbon performance hasn't. It's still concrete, as Sam mentioned, whereas I notice yours, you use a lot of timber, so that's kind of good in terms of environmental responsibility. So what was it trying to solve? I've mentioned problems of declining space standards, but it was about trying to move away from the double loaded corridor, the flats that are north facing that get no sunlight or direct sunlight at any time during the day. I mean, you might look at this and think actually it's quite reasonable. They've all got balconies and they're reasonable sizes. This certainly isn't the worst of the schemes that we were seeing at the time. There were many others that wouldn't provide any outdoor amenity, and arguably were probably much longer corridors with more single aspect. Now, why is that important? Because natural cross ventilation helps cool homes. It also reduces overheating, which is becoming a much greater issue as climate changes. And also we've now again since upgraded our regulations to better protect against overheating. So better arrangements might be this sort of example, where instead of a long corridor, you get clusters of flats, where you get a mix of through flats with dual aspect, corner flats, which again have dual aspect, and maybe the smaller ones in the middle are your single aspect apartments. Or the example that Kate showed earlier, sort of gallery access, again, has become a lot more common now since the introduction of the London Housing Design Guide. We saw it a lot in the 60s and 70s, modernist schemes, and they're now kind of being revisited. Again, promotes good through flats, dual aspect, natural light right into the depth of the plan, in this case into the kitchen or even the bathroom, and then cross ventilation. I'll just sort of touch on some of, I'm not going to go exhaustively through all the requirements, but I'll touch on the sort of range of things that we were looking at. And just to note that the guide is set out to have two different approaches. There's a must and a should. And the must is what is required both specifically for funding. So any standard in the document that says development, well, in this example, development proposals must demonstrate how densities accommodate sound understanding of public transport accessibility. So that's about both efficient land use, promoting high density where there's good public transport, but also trying to resist high density where there's no infrastructure. Whereas there's also a should, which is a nice, not just a nice to have. I mean, it comes down to the ability and the strength of planning officers to push for those requirements. So a couple of examples where in the section on street front door, all main entrances to houses, ground floor flats and communal entrances should be visible from the public realm, clearly identified. They should be well illuminated and they should have level access. And another example, which was mentioned in Kate's introduction, dwellings should be no more than 8 per floor, so off a landing, which again means you get more corner flats, more dual aspect. Now, the challenge now is that's becoming really unviable. It proved very successful for at least a decade since the introduction of the guidance, but now with the new Building Safety Act, it's being really put under pressure, this, because of the second stair requirements. What else mentioned here? Again, the requirements for lift provision has now moved on because of our Building Safety Act. So it's now more particular around evacuation lifts and fire safety, firefighting lifts. But just to illustrate some of the sort of types that were being kind of advocated for, that we'd heard about the deck access, also perhaps atrium arrangements where you get light into the circulation, shorter blocks of double-loaded corridors, more kind of point blocks with a central core, and then pairs of flats either side of core. And it's really trying to push against this arrangement where we've seen some real horrors in the past where you just get kind of Unit A style, kind of really long corridors, no light, no natural light, or if you do get it, you get this sort of pinpoint of high contrast. Now, this was the key one that really kind of changed the landscape in London in terms of a presumption against single aspect units, and where sites are unfavourable, such as up against railway lines or noise pollution, then you had to demonstrate how good ventilation and daylight could be provided in lieu of the dual aspect. And then the space standards, and this is the one that initially met with a lot of resistance, but actually has been well received and well adopted. So we set out a set of requirements based on the occupancy numbers, ranging from, apologise, square meterage, 50 square meters for a 1-bedroom, 2-person. So basically we set out requirements for flats, 2-story houses and 3-story houses, and ranging from sort of 2-person occupancy up to 6-person. But there was a clear measure that you could then, if there were larger family houses, you could then extrapolate what the increase would need to be. As I mentioned, there was a lot of pushback so the way our guidance like this gets adopted, it has to go to formal consultation and be put out to the public. And we knew there'd be resistance, so we did viability testing and ensured that, worked out what the possible impact would be. And there was sort of concern that it would actually impact not so much on build costs, but actually land value, which were overinflated anyway. So perhaps not a bad thing. Actually, the other reflection was that there was only about just above 20% of homes being built at the time would actually weren't meeting the standards. So although they're generous, they weren't so onerous that many developers weren't already meeting them. And then we just looked at some examples where, for example, the requirement for 8 dwellings per floor, there was a sort of critique that it might adversely affect the net to gross, decreasing saleable area, and therefore development viability. But again, through research and examples, this one in particular proved that actually the extra value you get from the sort of more dual aspect apartments would actually compensate for the uplift in cost. So I'll touch on briefly how the standards came about, and the space standards specifically. And the thinking was that the majority of families have similar needs. So taking what used to be the housing quality indicators, we developed a schedule of typical furniture requirements that provide a basic quality of life in a home, and came up with standard sizes, but also allowed for the circulation and activity areas around furniture. So from this, you can see slightly fuzzy, but you'd have your 2-person, your 3-person amounts of furniture within the home. And so we scheduled that out. So you can see on the top left how kitchen sizes need to increase and your amount of kitchen units increase as the family grows. Likewise, furniture, beds as well, from single to double. And then we basically did a spatial exercise of populating the sort of most efficiently planned rooms using this furniture, including the sort of dotted line showing activity zones, passing spaces, and so on, and room for a turning circle if you were in a wheelchair. And so we did this by each room type: bedroom, kitchen, living, bathroom, or rather in this case, kitchen, dining rooms, for each different occupancy size. And then from it, produce this table. And from that, we could then consolidate all those areas, put in a net allowance for internal circulation, and then you come up with a square meter per home. And the reason we needed this evidence base is we knew the space standards would be challenged by the house builders. And by having this kind of proof, it meant that the house builders would have to argue back that people don't need that amount of furniture. Well, there are basics that you do need. So it provided a very robust evidence that worked well in terms of the consultation. And then also, as Kate alluded to, the outdoor amenity space was included, and that was the first time that had been introduced as a requirement in London. So just touch on a few examples. So combined kitchen, living, dining room, a minimum of 248 square foot, and then an uplift for every additional person. Single bedroom, 86 square foot, double bedroom, 129 square foot, and then outdoor space at 54 square foot, and then an uplift per person after that. And this is what it was trying to. So space standards in themselves aren't sufficient, because you then also have to avoid some of these sort of scenarios where you end up using up all your space just in circulation. So that's why, sorry, just going back to this, there were certain things like minimum corridor widths, minimum allocation per room rather than just per dwelling. And it's really trying to promote better layouts like this, which perhaps I haven't got time to go through the detail, but more flexible layouts, more usable space. So that, as a headline, was what we were trying to achieve. It was adopted in 2010. It was applied across tenures, both from private market sale homes to affordable, and the industry really stepped up and did significantly change their output. We were subsequently commissioned in 2017 to draft an update to it, and this was the follow-on document adopted in 2022, I think. And it was a suite of documents, not just, there was an update of, in the top left here, of the housing design standards, and then there were other documents that promoted guidance on small sites development, particularly around design codes, as well as site optimization. And then I sort of mentioned that it went through stakeholder engagement. So as well as a formal process to adopt it, during the writing of the guidance, we undertook a lot of engagement and testing of the standards, and also understanding what homeowners and residents want. So just to conclude, I've got a couple more minutes, I wanted to show the sort of impact it had, because what was also talked about, as well as a technical requirement, it sort of spawned a sort of new form of expression in housing, which was widely termed the New London Vernacular. And for those familiar with London, we've got the kind of very familiar mansion blocks from Edwardian period, Georgian townhouses. Every era has its own kind of typology and form of architecture and expression of architecture. And these are just some examples, in this case, from our practice, of some of the homes we were designing at the time of writing the guidance. Simple brick architecture with generous windows. On the left, kind of balconies that allowed a new form of expression with deep facades that provide that solar shading, as well as that generous outdoor space. These examples by others, Alison Brooks on the left and Howard Tompkins on the right. Again, you start seeing a sort of common language, let's say, of architecture. And I think the better quality schemes were integrating balconies in a really intelligent way, adding depth into the facade, creating outdoor rooms, whereas sort of cheaper developers might just simply bolt them on, and they become a bit exposed. But you can see there's a sort of level of both richness in character and detail, but equally a sort of commonality in these schemes. So again, some others by DRMM Architects and I think Shepherd Robson on the left. But a greater quality of landscape, public realm, strong relationship to the street and the ground floor condition, and then a generosity to the architecture, and then even kind of fruitier architecture, some really expressive examples here from Matthew Lloyd and Eliza Morrison. So equally applying on the right-hand side to tall buildings and working well. So these examples from ours, I think the balconies really did kind of change the expression of architecture, and we've always kind of been interested in how you kind of add depth and layering to facades with generous outdoor space. And then internally, I think one of the sort of pushbacks to these sort of standards was that they would limit spatial richness and variety. And again, these are just some examples from our portfolio to kind of prove that actually standards aren't a means to dumbing down and reducing quality, but actually can still allow for real interesting, varied interior spaces. So I'll leave it at that and pass on to Karl. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Okay, I will share mine and probably be pretty quick so that we can get to a discussion. Does this look right to everyone?
Yeah.
All good. Thanks.
Okay. So I think just to give a little bit of context, I'm assuming that maybe a large portion of the audience is familiar with MOH, but in case not, the Mayor's Office of Housing, shorthanded to MOH, is responsible for housing the homeless, developing affordable housing, and managing the city's real estate. So it's a division within the City of Boston government. Within MOH, there are a number of different departments focused on different things from support and stability for housing, such as kind of Office of Housing Stability, helping residents, the Boston Home Center. I'm within the Neighborhood Housing Development Division, and we work closely with all of these, but I think the design standards are driven more towards new construction, but when applicable, there are kind of renovation and preservation projects that also lean on the standards for guidance. They're a little more constrained working within existing buildings. We also work with the Housing Innovation Lab, which I think is key in pushing towards kind of new implementations or prototyping certain policies, new kind of design test fits and ideas within MOH. So I think each group kind of working in tandem and in different ways towards housing for Boston. And I think just a kind of broad overview at what shaped our standards, we kind of tried to organize them into 3 different buckets. So health and safety, climate and the environment, and then kind of economy and market forces. So within kind of each of these circles, different existing standards or codes. I think Sam and Kate did a good job in the introduction setting the groundwork of what some of those are. But I think it starts at the base level in health and safety with the sanitary code, so minimums for habitable space, working out from there, incorporating things like ADA requirements, and for Massachusetts MAAB, Massachusetts Architectural Access Board, building code, and then city initiatives, one of them being this one that was developed with the City Office of Public Health for Kids Can't Fly, which kind of understanding safety around window openings and window treatments, especially for higher buildings beyond first level, single story units. And then environment and climate initiatives such as LEED, the Massachusetts Energy Code, and Boston's adoption of the specialized and stretch codes. Things like community feedback, I think, apply to all 3 kind of buckets, and working with our counterparts at the planning department around zoning, urban design guidelines, different levels of review there. In terms of economy, I think from an affordable housing standpoint, the way that the guidelines are shaped are in conjunction, but also in kind of preparing projects to put together funding to subsidize their projects. So I think a lot of projects have to seek assistance and funding from various agencies, be it at a federal level or state level and city level. So incorporating our standards with requirements from HUD, with EOHLC, and also working in conjunction with the Boston Home Center, who interface with residents who live in the housing to better understand things like kind of maintenance questions, durability, how the units will be marketed. And so these are kind of a cloud of the different influences to what's helped shape the MOH standards over the years. Kind of fairly recent history, if we want to look back kind of pre-2012, the standards were coming out of kind of basic requirements, a lot of them informed by community engagement and interaction, trying to understand things like concerns both from residents and neighbors, really provide health and safety. And I think there's a kind of conversation in the US about what is affordable housing, and making sure that projects that are kind of affordable or income restricted meet a certain quality of construction. They're kind of not relegated to, you know, the cheapest, lowest standards possible, but giving residents kind of high quality spaces, construction that will require limited maintenance, but still kind of hold up through time. I think moving on to 2012, there was an effort to more coordinate at different levels between the city and state. So what was at the time DHCD, MOH, and Mass Housing came together and kind of unified a set of standards that in 2016-ish kind of broke apart, and then they separated out again, which offered more flexibility, a little less consistency, but then the city could develop standards that were more tailored specifically to Boston's goals and ideas around housing. 2020, I think, was a major update, and we can look at this, but also how this, not only the standards, but MOH kind of pushed to streamlining review process with a series of checklists. And all along the way, different initiatives, lead zero emission buildings, Kids Can't Fly and Smoke Free are kind of working with different city departments and initiatives on providing healthy built environments, both interior and exterior. And then this most recent edition, which we'll show, is kind of updating for updates to the building code, energy code, and then moving more towards providing kind of a graphic diagram and example layouts that meet what was previously more text-based, kind of written understandings, so that when it comes to kind of early on, especially developing projects, that there's guidance and projects could move quickly to do a kind of analysis or test fitting of the standards. The current standards, an effort across many departments in the city, Mayor's Office of Housing, Boston Planning Department, the Environment Department, Disabilities Commission, Boston Age Strong, and the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, I think, to really provide standards that facilitate projects that are responsive to environmental concerns with resiliency and energy use, being accessible, and providing really high quality spaces to a diverse range of population, which is, I think, both kind of what has been typical, but also more and more kind of the need for an aging population. The purpose of the standards, I think, to summarize it, would be to really focus on kind of sensitivity to context and existing neighborhoods, building types, massings, open space, and public realm, to provide a kind of pathway towards economical construction, given that with affordable projects, there's a very tight constraint on funding, and to maximize accessible, welcoming spaces for people with different needs and abilities that can kind of adapt and still be useful throughout the lifespan of both residents and the building themselves. So for the MOH standards, and again, this is for projects that receive city funding, they are in conjunction with the review process. So we work with teams from schematic design to all the way through contract documents, and still projects that we are funding, we work with teams through construction administration during the actual build out of the project. And so the standards touch on things throughout all those levels of development, and kind of pick up and have picked up historically through through experience, just rolled in some of the items we've encountered that either don't perform well or need to be kind of specially considered. I think given that all of the subsidized housing is still run through private development, there is this kind of benchmark that we will be handing off projects to residents or property managers, and they need to be durable and kind of provide something that will not require a lot of exceptional maintenance throughout their lifespan. Whereas if we were kind of still owners of the project, that could be something that the city figures out. But given that they're funded and kind of handed off, either sold through home ownership units or then rented through another party, I think the standards and materials especially are geared towards things that we know will continue to perform throughout a long lifespan. The different section. Yep.
Just gonna let everyone know we do have 15 more minutes. So this will go till 1:15 if everyone has time to stay, but maybe Karl, as we could leave a few minutes for discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt.
Nope, no worries. And then I think these are kind of an overview of chapters of the standards. So rehab and preservation for projects that are coming in with existing buildings, new construction, focusing on sustainability, site development and planning. I think this is where we work really closely with the planning department, kind of questions of context, public realm, open space, and urban design. And then interior quality of the units, I think, is what MOH specifically has the kind of tightest voice on. So providing units that are accessible and have kind of generous spaces for different sized families. I think our units are generally a bit larger than market rate, but that's to kind of ensure that people who are moving into subsidized units who lack kind of maybe the availability of choices of the market aren't stuck with something that's substandard. So I think we've provided appendix of different unit types and layouts from 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, and studio. And then also started to get into providing a kind of assemblage of kitchen layouts and bathroom layouts, rolling into that various codes and guidelines that were kind of scattered around. We've started to try to kind of consolidate them into our space so that project teams don't have to hunt and search for those. They can kind of pick up our guidelines and know that they've been incorporated into those. All right, wrap it up.
Thanks, Karl.
Thanks, Karl.
No, that was great, super robust, and really helpful to explain the timeline as well, and how the synchronicity with other guidelines is ebbed and flowed and is a kind of challenging mechanism. Well, thank you both a lot. Kate and I have questions, but maybe we'll just open it up right away. And if anyone has any question for anyone here, just raise your hand and I can call on you. And if not, don't worry, I have questions.
Yeah, we can start. My first question was really about thinking about, London is very standardized. Boston is much more developer-led, market-focused, and perhaps kind of more nimble in being able to kind of accommodate what the market wants much faster. And an example of that might be, in Boston, there's maybe 2 or 3 types of 1-bed units. So ones that have, a room which maybe doesn't have access to a window, but is a study. Smaller 1-beds, So my question maybe is to Alex. I'm curious about how London can kind of accommodate market requirements as they change, you know, specifically maybe after COVID when there was more of a need in housing to have a desk space in your living room or, you know, things like that. Like how does it evolve and can it evolve quickly?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion that was when I was working as a mayor's design advocate for the mayor. Post-pandemic, there was sort of recovery plan, and one of the sort of questions was about whether standards had to be revisited. There is allowance and reasonable generosity to the existing LHDG standards for working from home space. Although it's curious that our space standards are probably ours plus the balcony space seem to be similar to your overall interior space. So you're building more generously. So there's more future proofing, I guess, for changing lifestyles. There hasn't been any major sort of shift, I'd say, in standards and policies as a result of the pandemic specifically. But there has been, just in answer to your point about market forces, there have been some quite interesting sort of new typologies emerging. So, and I don't know whether it's a sort of clever get around to avoid space standards, but we have, for example, a thing called pocket homes, which is about a sort of subsidized or below market. Sort of they're being sold 20% below market price, but which is locked in perpetuity. And that's a way of getting more affordable homes on the market as opposed to subsidized rental homes. And so they kind of have got an allowance to build smaller. We're also seeing more co-living, which is a new type that we didn't have when we were doing LHDG. And standards have been written now for those sort of specialist types of housing.
That's interesting. I mean, I have a similar question about the market, and you kind of answered it with talking about the research you did to prove the value of dual aspect or the net to gross or you know, the counterpoint to developers crying foul. But I could think, Karl, I mean, you know, if tomorrow City of Boston required balconies, then everyone would cry foul because you've just raised the cost of construction on everyone everywhere, and we're in a housing crisis, and kind of the goal is to get as many units as possible. I'm just wondering how we balance, and how do you set up that conversation, how you do the research behind it, to up housing quality standards in a constrained market. I mean, it's a political leadership question, maybe it's also like a design research and framing question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I'd say the one thing that I always struggle with is we don't do enough kind of post-occupancy or post-construction analysis to see like what certain projects actually cost in the end. We kind of do track that through construction, but I think getting all of that information from projects to really see like what is the cost of adding balconies? Are the projects that have them significantly more expensive when you cut them during the design process in an effort to save costs? Does that money just show up somewhere else? So I think, and I also just think that when they are required, I just think it's nice not to have that on the chopping block. Like it is a requirement. I think Alex, you mentioned there's a lot of data that backs up the benefit to mental health and well-being of having those spaces. So I think it's like, okay, we're gonna save $6,000 a unit or something by not having a balcony. Is that worth the kind of long-term impact of not having a provision for that type of space in the city?
Yeah, that was definitely the rationale in London that actually if you're going to build more and build denser, then actually we need to build for the long term and make sure that it's of a quality with good amenity. Yeah.
Miranda, go ahead.
Hello, I'm from London. I used to work with Kate. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. Hi, Miranda.
Hi. A really interesting conversation. Thank you very much, Karl and Alex. I have a question for both of you. What we're talking about is guidance, very important, and the goodies follow it. But the naughties do not. So no matter how much guidance we have, there's still. So in the UK, we have the Housing Act, which is the legislation, and that's the true space standards, Alex, isn't it? In terms of, when you're going around and you're not going through a planning process, you don't necessarily have to, or you could do permitted development, which is a way of sometimes changing use, or if you're working with vulnerable communities and you're I'm talking around kind of emergency housing and homeless shelters, there's legislation is where the teeth are, I suppose, and then sometimes enforcement. But unfortunately, that's an area in the UK that hasn't really changed for a very, very long time. So we have great updates of guidance, particularly in London Plan, but not so much. The Housing Act, is really quite similar, hasn't really evolved much. And I was wondering what your views are on this and how, as an industry, we can kind of really create that sort of change within the Housing Act, and what would be the equivalent in Boston also, like where does statutory gazump guidance, and is there proper enforcement of that as well? Sorry, broad question, hope that made sense.
Shall I kick off and then Karl? I think that's a really good point. I suppose it's interesting that for the benefit of everyone, the London Housing Design Standards went on to influence our nationally described space standards. So it was interesting that there was a shift at a government level to do more to kind of advocate for good technical standards across the board in housing. The weakness, as Miranda you've just alluded to, is that it's down to each local authority to then choose to adopt them. And I think I'm right in saying that it's something like only 30%, or it's pretty low percentage of authorities that have then chosen to adopt the nationally described space standards. And obviously the London guide was about general needs housing. It would have become too complex if we'd started looking at specialist housing, later living, Sam mentioned, student housing, and importantly, as you've just mentioned, Miranda, the sort of homeless and temporary housing. And I think there is definitely a need to address that, and just pick up the fact that everyone has it's a human right to shelter a safe and affordable home, and it feels that that's not being addressed fully at a national level.
And I think in the context of Boston, so there's a little bit of a difference, at least from the Mayor's Office of Housing side, is on projects that we're working with, we're financially supporting or partially financially supporting those projects. So the guidelines and standards from us have the teeth in the sense of, well, if you are seeking funding, you're going to adhere to these standards. So they're not as kind of broadly applicable, which is where I think the forthcoming, I think there's an effort to provide guidelines from the planning department, which would apply to both market rate and affordable. But I also think that Boston's interesting and kind of convoluted, I guess, where that overlaps with zoning, which would have most teeth. Right now, Boston zoning is very prohibitive. I guess what people frequently say is you couldn't build what exists now with our zoning as it is, which is mostly true. So it's a very negotiable process. I think almost every project seeks variance from the zoning, and as that is updated, you would see less negotiation. So I think in one sense, just anecdotally, places I've lived, Boston is very consistent in terms of design. It kind of has this fabric that is legible throughout the city. It reads very in a controlled manner. And I think that's partly because of the negotiation process around design, but that can also be kind of ambiguous and unclear. And I think a lot of people find that draws out the design process quite a bit. So then when we get a more clear kind of toothy answer, if you're adhering to that, you get what you get. And I think there's quite a bit less of that negotiation. So we'll see how that would end up playing out.
Thanks,
Well,
both.
I don't know if this is going to just end in like 1 minute, but thank you everyone so much. I have more questions, but I'll have to follow up later. Thank you so much, Alex, Karl, Miranda for the question, Kate,
Thank
David,
you.
BSA, Sai, and yeah, I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you later individually over a beer and keep pushing better design quality of housing.
Yeah,
Thanks everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks very
everyone.
much. Bye.
Bye.